Alex here with a video on the problem of voting. Now, this video could very easily devolve into voters are dumb and that's why we have bad people elected. But that's actually not what I believe. I know that there are two really simplistic, in fact, I would call it overly simplistic ideas as to how to fix the system, which I don't think would fix the system at all. So the first overly simplistic idea is that we just need everyone to vote. It's true that quite a big chunk of the population doesn't vote in the presidential election. And when it comes to non-presidential, it's even worse by a lot. And so there's this idea that all we need is for everybody to vote, and then we'll have an amazing government. No, you'll just see bigger numbers with the same problems. You may see different candidates getting elected to office, but you're still going to have the same types of candidates, and you're just going to see um, like 80 or 90% of people voted. But why didn't things get better? It doesn't change anything, in my opinion. It feels good. Maybe people can feel proud of themselves that most of them voted, but it's not going to actually change the system of governance that they're under. In fact, I've heard of countries that actually make it a crime to not vote. I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong and these countries don't exist. But guys, if you are in a country that will punish you for not voting, please post it down in the comments below so that they can be ridiculed. What a ridiculous idea if that's true. I mean, I've heard people say that. Please confirm this for me, guys. I've heard people say that their country says they have to vote, so they'll go and they'll just push the buttons. They won't know who any of them are. They'll just push them all and then punch the ticket to get it out, and they'll go home. It's like, how believable is that, Alex? Very believable. If you criminalize something and people don't want to do it, they're just going to make a farce out of it. I hope that this isn't true. The second thing is, I think, okay, this is going to sound really bad. You're going to have to hear me out. A lot of people think that voters need to get more educated and research the candidates. This is completely not realistic. In my very strong opinion, most voters want to make decisions like a CEO. And this is going to sound nuts, but in my opinion, most voters don't want to go out and do all of the research, and they won't do it. And if you scold them about it, they will just ignore it. A lot of times there are these approaches where, people kind of guilt, maybe not necessarily a friend guilting a friend, but from the government's perspective, maybe from the news media, talking about the importance of becoming an educated voter. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean somebody is going to spend hours and hours researching every single candidate? It can't. It's not at all realistic, and most people do not want to do that, and they won't do it. What instead happens is most voters will make the decision, which is what voting is. They'll decide a candidate, which is what they want to do, based on sources that they trust. That's what's going on right now, and that will never change. I do not believe that will change because that is what people want. Most people want that. There's a small percentage of people that do research. They are researchers and they love it. And what would be nice is for those specific people to become influencers of the people who don't want to do the research. Um, that would be ideal, I think. That's probably the best thing that you're going to get is somebody who loves doing research, who goes into every single little tiny thing of a candidate, who's able to comb through the information and shove aside the stuff that really isn't that important and point out the stuff that's concerning or alarming or very beneficial and positive. And hopefully, that particular person who's done all that research is not just a voter who counts for one vote, because if he does, that's an extraordinarily inefficient use of their time. I heard this from a political consultant who was uh, helping I don't want to see, he was hired to assist with the judicial campaign. And I didn't exactly know that there was sort of a term for it or an understanding of it. But once he told me, I was like, this is what I've noticed too. This is what I've observed too. Just like I mentioned in my other videos, just because I observe something doesn't necessarily mean that I endorse it. It's just my observation. It's just what I notice. So hopefully, the particular person who spent all those hours doing all that research is an influencer and has the attention of hundreds or maybe thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of people that they can then influence and say, hey, this is the person that you should vote for because, and they have all their reasons. And hopefully those people who trust that person will go ahead and do that. In some of these situations, you do have, a guy who, and this happens a lot with judicial races, a guy who gets like 20 or 30 text messages from his friends and neighbors saying, hey, which judge should I vote for? And I know that this happens. And the guy, usually a lawyer, will usually say, these are the ones that you should vote for. And they'll go and do it. So, for better or for worse, this is a thing that happens. And I think that this is a great way for researchers to leverage all of the time they put into a race. Now, 10, 20, 30 people, does that make it worth it to me? No. In my opinion, really good, researchers who care about society, who know who to vote for, and whether they've done the research or they work in the field like a lawyer, I think they should be able to influence thousands, 5,000, 10,000, lots of people, because that's really the most realistic way I think that voting will ever get better in this country. Right now, what we have is people who trust non-researchers, and we're talking about the mainstream media outlets and the talking heads and the pundits. Maybe they do research and they have decided that they have picked a side, or they don't do any research at all and they've just picked a side because that's who they like. So it's like they have all of this influence, but they themselves are not researchers. That's where so much of the damage is coming from. Is you'll have pundits on the red team and the blue team who either they do research and they only expose the flaws of the other side, or they don't do any at all, and they themselves just blindly trust somebody, typically the party that they're a member of. And so you have non-researchers who are extremely ignorant influencing hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And so a lot of times people will get very angry and say you shouldn't trust them, you need to do your own research, but they don't want to do that. And so the solution to the problem isn't so much to get people to reject the advice of these ignorant influencers. It is to replace the ignorant influencers with good ones. That's, in my opinion, the only realistic way to solve the problem of voting. Is that, have you ever heard I don't know if I talk about this in the problem of media, don't hate the player, hate the game. It's a very true sort of saying, because the candidates who are getting elected, they may be using the dirtiest, scummiest tactics and engaging in deceit and deception to win their election, but that's the only way that they can win. So for us to really expect a good candidate, in quotation marks, a statesman, to refuse to do all of those terrible things and still get elected somehow, it's just unrealistic. And if it does happen, it's going to be once in a blue moon. So you're not going to see an entire system shift. You're going to see, sparks of light that, come up and then they're gone. So really, somehow, some way, society has to figure out how to change the game. And that is really the tricky part, because that isn't something that I think would be solved by everybody figuring out how to do research. I mean, to a certain extent, in fact, probably to a major extent, that is going to have to happen from within the institution itself, possibly from elites. And there may be a minority of them who believe that that's the path forward, but they just don't have the there's no path of actual success, no way for them to actually change anything. So they're just lurking there in silence. I don't think that this is something that the population as a whole, like a popular idea, can actually fix. I know that there are some attempts. For example, we have, what do they call it? Ranked choice voting. They have other names for it. I think countries do. You know what? If you're in a country that uses ranked choice voting, go ahead and post it down in the comments below, because I'd be interested to think what you think about that. I suspect that that is a small step in the right direction, but I think you're still going to see flawed candidates and flawed elections where, and you know what? I guess I'll talk about that next. So I talked about ordinary people like a CEO wanting to make decisions, and voting is no different than that. People are decision makers. There's a certain, I don't know if I want to call it pride, sense of pride. It's maybe let's call it sort of sense of importance. When you get to make a decision, whether it's a small one that just affects you, a medium-sized one that affects your family, or I guess you could think of it as a big one that is a vote to determine who's going to run the country. People want to make that decision, but as I mentioned earlier, they don't want to spend 10 or 20, 100 hours doing the research on that. Now, some people might say, well, that's really irresponsible of them, but you'll notice that there are actually other areas where this is done. Like, you could say a boss of a store, or I mentioned earlier, a CEO of a company. They are not doing all of the research. They don't have that much time. They are a single human being. They have a limited amount of time. They can research the big stuff, but they mostly rely on a council. Now, they don't call them a council. They probably call them like a board. They have other names for those positions that are up in corporate America, whatever, these corporations. But they are relying on information from other people who have done the research. They've paid those people to do all of that research and to give them or make decisions themselves and or give them the information that they need as a CEO to make a decision. The difference is that they are getting information from trusted advisors. I'm going to continue to use that word, not a capital A, just a lowercase a. People are giving them advice that they expect to be in good faith, honest advice. And so they are making decisions based on people that they can trust that are not trying to trick them. That is not what happens right now in America when it comes to voting. Instead, people are getting advice from people that they oftentimes know are lying. They know that there are two sides that are running for something, and they know that those two sides are giving deliberately deceptive information. And a lot of times what people think is, well, the truth is somewhere in the middle. If you could you imagine a CEO of a company having advisors that they know for sure are lying to them and leaving things out, and they're supposed to figure out how to navigate that mess of deceit to make a decision that would not happen? The CEO would fire them all and replace them. But voters can't do that. Voters are stuck with people who are giving them information that is knowingly false or misleading. And then the voter is supposed to figure out which way to go. And then we wonder why people don't want to do research, because they know that everyone is lying to them. And it's such a mess of an idea to think that that's okay. And so that's another one of the problems with what I mentioned, influencers who aren't actually researchers who are doing objective analysis and giving their opinion as to who should be voted for to their particular group. Instead, you have red team versus blue team, and they're either doing research only in a slanted way or they're doing none at all. And they're giving all of this false information out and telling people to vote for a candidate based on nonsense. And we have voters now who are somewhat aware of this, but where they can't find the truth. They don't have. It's an absolutely insane idea, and it's what's leading to the craziness that's going on today. Um, I think the last thing I was going to talk about was autocracy, and this is based on my recent. I didn't really watch it. I listened to it. I think it was called Unfit. I'm not going to go into the politics of that. I really don't like how it's so Trump focused, because they really, I feel, missed an opportunity in that documentary, which was the documentary was mainly geared towards Trump is a really bad person, and that therefore you need to be aware of all of the things that he was doing. And then they go ahead and compare it to other autocrats, which I guess is a more accurate term for what we otherwise call dictators, and the type of government autocracy, which is government by one person. So the thing, the biggest thing about Unfit is it tries to get people to be afraid of the past and to accept that democracy is extraordinarily flawed and to not fall for the seductive promises of autocrats. And it goes into all of these horrible things in the past that have happened when governments have devolved into autocracy. And that is what I think is the greatest missed opportunity, is that that would never work. I mean, to a certain extent, you can insulate and armor people a little bit with some knowledge, but if the system continues to get worse, eventually, even if they are aware of history, they will still choose to buck democracy and go with an autocrat. If the system gets bad enough, you will still end up with autocracy. And that is the problem, is that instead of trying to shame people or scare people or say you guys are ignorant and you don't know history and that's why you're going to make the same mistake, instead of all of those things, which in my opinion will not work. A system will always get, or a system could potentially always get bad enough that no matter how much the population has been prepared for it, they will still go with autocracy. The real missed opportunity there was for, in my opinion, democracies to really understand the importance of figuring out how to make it work. You can't just expect society to suffer and suffer and suffer the incompetence um, of the system and not eventually decide to reject the system. And that's my biggest. If you get a chance, I hope that you guys are able to go and watch the movie Unfit and sort of come and listen to the portion of this video right at the end right now that I'm doing and realize that it's really, in my opinion, it's more, the blame lies more upon the United States government, the states and the federal government, than it does on Trump. Because if the system was not getting as bad as it was getting, if society was not getting as desperate as it was getting, and it's getting worse, autocrats, potential autocrats, would not be able to get into power. And it's very similar with what happened in the past with countries like Nazi Germany and stuff like that, where, and Italy, where the autocrat will typically exploit the flaws of the system. They will point out what's not working for people. And that's also mentioned in the Unfit, I guess, I don't know, I'll call it a documentary. That's also mentioned in the Unfit documentary, which is that beware autocrats because they're going to point out all of the flaws of the system. And it's like, hold on a second. Shouldn't we as a society eliminate the flaws? Instead of just telling people, hey, there's going to be all of these problems, just be aware that somebody's going to try to exploit them to get your vote. They'll still vote for the guy. They'll still vote for the guy. If it gets bad enough, they will still vote for the guy because they want the flaws, they want the problems to stop depending on how bad it's getting. That's the biggest underline that I can give you. I mean, people will tolerate a certain amount of incompetence and unfairness in a society, in democracy. But the worse it gets, the more that they see their family starting to suffer, the more that they themselves start to hate living, the closer that they get to saying, you know what, this system isn't working. Let's just switch over and try what this guy's saying, especially when if they're ignorant. So like if they don't know the purpose of the legal system, for example, if they're ignorant about the court system and the judges, they could very easily say, I don't know what any of that stuff is anyway. I don't like court. I don't go to court. I don't care if they eliminate it, if they get rid of it. We don't need it. We can just have this guy decide what the laws are going to be. And this guy can decide who's going to go to jail. You guys don't understand how easily that could happen if the system gets bad enough and people are suffering enough. And so this whole notion, and I don't think they just talk about Trump, they talk about Putin and other rulers. This whole notion that they're going to point out the flaws of democracy to undermine it, duh. That's what I say to that. Of course they're going to do that. That's the biggest duh on the planet. And so trying to shame people into not falling for it is, in my opinion, a failure of the documentary and the people who have a lot of money to understand the plight and the suffering of the people who probably don't. And if they would understand that, then they would understand why they would consider voting for an autocrat. So really, I think that it's incumbent on the system itself, the democratic system, the people who benefit from the system, which would include landlords, lenders, businesses, the government. It's incumbent on them to make sure that people are satisfied and that they have good lives. They have to do that. That's the way to really confront autocracy, is to make sure that democracy is working. If it's not working, it will implode. It's a guarantee that it will, because the people who have the ability to vote will say enough is enough. And if it's not in their best interest, think about it from their perspective. Their life already sucks anyway. How much worse could it get? A lot of people will say, well, it can get a lot worse, Alex. It's true, but they aren't going to think that way. They're not going to be thinking that way. They're not going to go all into it. They're going to elect an autocrat. That's what they're going to do. So really, I hope that's what that people sort of take away at the end of this video. I mean, if you don't like autocrats and the idea of autocracy and totalitarian regimes and all that stuff coming to your democracy, then somehow, some way, your democracy has to figure out how to make itself actually work. Scolding people into accepting the incompetence and the flaws and the corruption is nonsense. find out what's going on that's not working and fix it. That's what people really want. That's what I believe people want, is they want to live a happy life in their house with their family, with their wife slash husband slash kids, and go to graduations and parties and have a good time. And if they can't do that, they're gonna vote for crazy people. They just are. I hope that this video makes a lot of sense to people. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them down below, and I will see you guys next time.